Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today is Tom Michaels, professor of horticulture at the University of Minnesota and founder of the Open Source Seed Initiative. Our theme today is industrial hemp and its glories. How you doing, Tom?
I'm doing well. It's really a pleasure to be back.
Well, I am glad that you're back. We have quite an interesting topic here today. It's something that in my state, in Washington, is probably not all that, let's say, uncommon to talk about because hemp and cannabis is used in Washington quite a bit. But a lot of people listening around the world probably don't have a lot of the knowledge that you do in this, as well as the benefits that industrialized hemp can bring. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what your background is for those that didn't hear the previous episode?
Absolutely. So, I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm in the Department of Horticultural Science, where half my time is spent doing teaching, mostly with undergrads, but some graduate students as well. And the other part of my time is spent doing research. And over the years, I have done a lot of work with food crops, particularly with dry edible beans, but I also work with sweet sorghum for syrup now, and some other crops like lettuce and so on. But there's this theme of I enjoy working with crops that I can eat. And recently, once Minnesota had an industrial hemp pilot program that was approved, I became interested in that because, of course, hemp grain can also be used as a food crop. So there we go. That's what I do.
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize that. Most people, when they think of mass crops, right, you're thinking corn and soy,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. And
And
I mean, there's no wonder for that, right? You do enough traveling, you
oh
see
yeah,
from the interstate, there's not much else.
yeah, no, it's pervasive, and now we are starting to see, but not just now, but over the past couple of decades, we've actually started to see health problems with the concentration of two primary ingredients, right? Um, we can get into that a little bit later, but I'm kind of curious though. I mean, obviously you mentioned one of the things you really enjoy is working with crops that you can eat. I'm also a big fan of that. I'm a master gardener from Oregon State, and I don't do as much of it as I used to. But I kind of got into this groove where if I can't use it, I don't plant it. So we have herbs, for example, and when in the garden season, we'll do tomatoes and peppers and things like that. And we don't normally do, I don't know, flowers, right? Not that there isn't an intrinsic value to flowers, but if they're not edible, it's like a one-off for us. So I truly appreciate that. Now, your specialty is plant breeding and genetics. We actually got into that a little bit on the previous episode when we were talking about the Open Source Seed Foundation. Can we talk? What are you focused on right now? I mean, you mentioned a little bit in lettuce, but it's really about hemp, right?
That's right. That is the primary plant I'm working with now. I have always focused on trying to develop new varieties, new cultivars of the crops I work with for farmers to grow. For part of my career, I was very farmer oriented in terms of the characteristics that I was breeding for. So things that were higher yield, things that were easier to grow, had a better architecture, but always with that lens of what can I do to make the farmer's job easier. Maybe in the last 20 years, I've switched to more the consumer view of things to as I started working more with organics, what can I do to improve flavor or edible quality or visual quality, those sort of things. So that's switched a bit. But when I started moving into hemp, then the idea was, can we develop uh, new varieties of industrial hemp that are highly adapted to production in the upper Midwest here where I'm located?
Now I'm glad you brought that up. That was going to be one of my points. Is that what we're really talking about here? Is we're not talking about Colorado. We're talking about Minnesota,
Right.
where it gets so cold that you connect your buildings so that you don't have to walk outside.
That is literally true.
Yeah.
Especially on campus here, you can do a lot of walking without a coat, and that's because of -20, right? So
Yeah, I mean, there's cold and then there's your eyelashes flaking off, right? I used to do a lot of winter backpacking, and I found that my kind of break point was literal zero, right?
yeah,
If it ever got below zero, I wouldn't even leave my tent.
yeah.
Um, Now with Minnesota, what's the growing? Now I was actually there last year. We went to I think it was University of Minneapolis or something like that with my daughter so that she could visit the campus. And beautiful state, but we were there in like late October, right? So the weather was still reasonable. But what kind of growing season do you have up there?
So when I think about the length of the growing season, one of the common denominators we have across the country is corn production. So just using that as our relative marker, early planting for corn in Minnesota, where I am here in southern Minnesota, would be mid-April. And usually the corn is in by the beginning of May. And then harvest time would be sometime, say, in October, maybe the second week or so. But again, another way to look at it, as a gardener, I think that the growing season pretty much starts 1st of May as far as planting seeds. Wouldn't put transplants out yet, but and then ends in October. The weird thing about the place, though, as you were mentioning the cold, is it gets hot here too. So we have the extremes. So to be in the low hundreds is not crazy. It happens, and so we have this short season uh, coming out of intense cold, but also we have this time of year. I think toward the end of this week we might be certainly in the high 90s.
So, would you be one of those states where I mean, obviously you have four seasons, but people would say we have two seasons, summer and winter?
Yeah, it's unfortunately true. We come out of really cold winters and snow, and all of a sudden we have 2 or 3 weeks of spring, and then bam, it's time to plant. So the soil heats up pretty quickly, and so you can get in the ground pretty well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm in Western Washington, northwestern Washington, and because of our proximity to the water,
Ah,
it has a tendency to. I mean, often. I mean, obviously, there's ways to do it with plastic and things like that. But if you just want to plant, it's not uncommon to not be able to plant until June because the overnight temperatures are just too cool. The soil doesn't heat up enough. In fact, this year was like that. I mean, it wasn't even until July that we had any real warmth.
wow. But
Um,
if you are growing something like, let's say, Swiss chard or kale or something like that, you can take that through the whole winter, can't you? You can do late harvest, maybe cover it up a little bit. It's not going to.
uh, yes, in fact, that's actually correct. I mean, the leafy greens, things like that, we definitely can continue on. I've never seen it in say December, but we definitely can go into late November. I'm sure others with with little what the tube the short tube type houses, you
Oh
can
yeah.
definitely grow much longer. But the other issue that we have is that, like, as of December, you wake up and it's dark, and before you get home, it's dark. You're lucky to
Right.
get. I mean, you know this, right? You're
Right.
lucky to get like the 8 hours of daylight, which makes it very difficult to grow
You're
without.
even further north than we are here, so shorter days in the winter, but nice long days in the summer. I bet you're enjoying that.
Oh yeah, I mean, end of June, it's dusk at 10, right?
Right, right.
All right. So, I mean, we could easily go off on corn here because I have a particular distaste for the corn lobby and the industrialized corn machine. But I think we'd like to focus on, why hemp? What is it that hemp is going to bring to, well, where you're at? But also, what is it do you think that it can bring to really farmers as a whole?
Well, let me tell you why I'm really enthusiastic about it. And to start off, I'll say that my background is in obviously in agricultural production and horticulture and agronomy and the breeding side of things. And as I mentioned before, kind of take the farmer's view in many cases. And and you've mentioned corn and you've mentioned soybeans, and we know that especially around me here, those are the dominant rotations. Yeah, some places are going to also grow sugar beets or potatoes, and some wheat is thrown in, but corn, soy, as you're going down the interstates, is what you see throughout the Midwest. And that lack of diversity is a problem in agriculture in terms of the health of the soil. So if we focus on what's good for the soil so that we can sustain our agricultural production, then immediately we start talking about, well, how do we increase the diversity so that we don't have one crop mining the heck out of the soil and exhausting it. So what can we do? And this is really what gets me so excited about working with hemp because uh, and I know there are a lot of hemp advocates who say that hemp can do everything, but and I'm not really of that ilk, but here's a situation that I think is true. I think that hemp, particularly for grain at the moment, could become a crop that can break into that two crop rotation, that corn soybean rotation, and add some diversity. The same way that growers can choose maybe to choose wheat, or maybe if they have animals can also grow alfalfa for a third crop. Hemp can do this. And when I talk about this to farmers, they immediately understand. It's not like farmers only want to grow corn and soybeans. It is part of the way the food system has developed, so they're kind of locked into that scheme. But if there were opportunities for more diversity, then I believe they would take it. And I think we can do that with hemp for grain.
And I would agree with you. But before we go down that path, one thing you mentioned sugar beets,
Oh
and
yeah.
just as a side note, what a lot of people don't realize is that there's a beet harvest, and one of the common things that I think I mentioned this previously is that I'm in a community of nomads, and when we travel in a school bus. Well, for full timers, it's not actually uncommon for full timers. They will work their way north for the beet harvest. And that is one of the ways they make money is that they go and they participate in the beet harvest and then they move on. I know it's completely an odd topic, but it kind of triggered from the mention of sugar beets.
No,
Um,
it's not an odd. I have heard of this, and I've read just from a sociological standpoint. It's really interesting to read some of the diaries or things that these folks have written and following the beet harvest. Yeah, because beets are a big deal in Minnesota. We grow more beets in Minnesota than anywhere else in the U.S., so it's a thing here.
yeah. Now, back you mentioned farmers. Obviously, we're talking about agriculture, so there's farmers involved, and I've spoken with quite a few farmers myself, and quite a lot of them don't want to grow corn and soy. It's just that, as you mentioned, from a societal or a corporation or a food manufacturing standpoint, that's where the yield is. That's where they can actually continue to survive. Is that your experience or knowledge?
Yeah, really. We talk about sustainable agriculture, and one of the pieces of sustainability that often gets talked about is the environmental, but economic sustainability is really important too. You got to keep your farm going. And so growers are going to look at, okay, they're really good at penciling things out. Is this going to turn me enough of a profit that I can farm next year? And that often then, when was kind of saying locked into the crop, that's the way they know they can do it with the least risk, perhaps, and continue to farm.
Well, and to continue the farm, I think, is key because obviously, from a societal perspective, you know, we as humans get into a culture of something, right? Either nowadays, over the past few decades, you have a culture of tech, but obviously with farmers, you have a cultures of farmers. I've been on this farm for you know it's been in my family for 7 generations, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it's what they know, and it's what they love. And the farmers that I talk to is in the area that I am, we have a lot of really micro farms, a lot of 5 acre farms, right? Homesteaders, farm stands, that kind of thing. And you talk to them and they just love it. But if you talk to them, why don't you just grow X? It would make you more money. They're like, but that's not what farming is about. For me, farming is about producing food. So you get the CSAs where they're every let's say every week you pick up a box, and the box has, it's got, like you said, it's got your greens, it's got your eggs, it's got your bread, and it supplements your shopping for the week, kind of thing. And it's I would encourage actually our listeners, if you're really just going to the store and picking up the box of dinner, you need to understand that that box of dinner is likely not even food. You really should go, if you have the opportunity, and make sure that you're buying real food. That being said, let's kind of talk about the donkey in the room, or the elephant in the room, which is cannabis. Now, hemp is a cannabis variety, correct?
Yeah, they're both cannabis sativa, so same species. And it really comes down to at the core of it, at the genetic level, really, it's one locus, one gene that is going to, depending on which alleles you have there, is this going toward THC or is it going towards CBD? Now, there's a whole lot of difference in terms of the look of the plant that can also happen, and people argue about that incessantly. But if we just want to say which cannabinoid are you accumulating, it's actually pretty simple.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, because in Washington State, the get high cannabis is legal. And also, obviously, medicinal cannabis, which, for our listeners, there's quite a bit of difference between, say, a 1 milligram THC, 40 milligram CBD intake versus, say, a 10 milligram THC, 10 milligram CBD intake. One of them being highly medicinal and anti-inflammatory, and the other one will get you high. But there's an interesting, one of the things that I've been reading recently is that, I don't know who's doing this, but companies or individuals or horticulturalists are now breeding hemp, which is not the hemp that we're talking about here, not the get high cannabis or the marijuana. Where they are actually extracting THC from this industrialized hemp. Obviously, it's not as efficient as something that already has high THC. But because it's not classified as, cannabis, technically, it's industrialized hemp, you're starting to see these supplements show up in like gas stations and things like this. Are you aware of that?
Oh, well, you foreshadowed something that I was going to tell you that you probably didn't know, but just in the last month, starting at the beginning of July 1, legislation in Minnesota went into effect that allowed the sale of essentially THC gummies and beverages, so long as that THC was extracted, as you just said, from hemp. So your starting material has to be 0.3% THC or lower, but this law allows then the sale and purchase of now. And there are some interesting rules around it, like each serving size has to be 5 milligrams of THC or less, and you can't have more than, I think it's 50 milligrams total per bag or something. Anyway, but yeah, exactly what you said has just become possible in Minnesota. And the laugh about it is, if you read the legislation, there are some people who think it was a mistake, like they didn't get the wording quite right in the legislation. They were trying to do something about managing the Delta 8 situation, and through the wording created an opportunity for the Delta 9. So it's, some say it was intentional, some say it was a mistake. It's kind of just funny Minnesota stuff going on right now.
Well, what was interesting, a quote that I heard from one of the legislators, I don't remember who it was, but they said, "Did we just legalize weed?"
It's exactly true.
right? And the funny thing about this is, and humanity will always find a way. Okay, no, that's why we're in the situation that we are now. Instead of, for example, going back to 100% organic, sustainable gardening, where we're rotating crops in a more micro way. And let's be honest, that causes a surge in food prices, right? Because you can't do it on a mass scale. So I'm not necessarily saying that the way we do it is quote unquote bad. I am saying though that everything has a cost. And so when you think about this cost, if we go all the way back in history, when through prohibition and when they started really attacking cannabis and marijuana, and then as we go forward in time over the last 10 years, where many states have started to realize that, why are we criminalizing something that is essentially harmless, right? It really is. And so you have something like a Washington where you can get the medicinal benefits. And you don't even need a license anymore. You just have to be 21, right? If I can drink alcohol, I can get weed. But what's more interesting to me here is one of the problems with states that have legalized the let's call it the real marijuana, the real cannabis, is that because it's federally technically still illegal, banks won't touch you.
Mm.
So you have a situation where these companies are you can't get Visa transactions, Mastercard transactions, anything like that. You have to deal in cash. Well, here's the interesting thing that Minnesota has done. Because Minnesota has now legalized the extraction from industrial hemp, which is federally legal, banks might be able to help Minnesota companies actually conduct business.
Isn't that interesting? I hadn't thought of that angle. Yeah.
Yeah, so you might actually end up with, because the in Washington, I don't know about other states, but in Washington, there's limitations as well, right? You can only have 100 milligrams per bag if we're talking about edibles, and each edible can only have a maximum amount of 10 milligrams CBD, or not CBD, THC. The CBD can be much higher, but the THC maxes out at 10. Well, in the Minnesota scenario, if it only maxes out at 5, that's really not that big of a deal. You would just take 2 if you want 10. And you could end up in a situation where basically we legalized weed without legalizing weed and actually created an economic boom for small cultivators to be able to actually function in Minnesota, because now the weed that everybody wants is actually coming, the THC is coming from industrialized hemp, which is federally legal. And thus they can work with getting a merchant account and things like that.
Yeah. Do you have a dispensary system in Washington State?
We do. We don't call them dispensaries anymore. The dispensaries, when they first legalized the marijuana, it was medicinal only.
Hmm.
And so, yes, you had to go get a card and you would go to a dispensary. But now it's actually recreational, and it's managed under the liquor board. So they
Ah,
act just like liquor stores. You
I
can't
see.
and the rules apply across the board. So, for example, in Washington, if you carry a concealed weapon, you are not allowed to take that weapon into a bar or a liquor store or a weed store, because it's
Ah,
under the same regulations.
got it.
And you have to be 21 to enter. And they check your ID the moment you step in. Within 3 feet, they're like, "May I see your ID?" So no, they're more like stores now, but yes, we used to have a dispensary system.
Well, one of the reasons I asked is that the legislation in Minnesota was was absent uh, any sort of regulation around the businesses. Really, it was more about the labeling and so on. And so, first of all, you can buy this at a 7-Eleven or a gas station for that matter, as well as a store that specializes in hemp, for instance. And the other thing was there was no mention of additional taxation or particular taxation of this. So that's another sort of indication that something was unusual about this bill
Yeah, you
because
most
politicians usually find ways to add taxes.
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the arguments actually for legalizing cannabis is it's twofold. One is that you can end up in a scenario or a situation with where you understand the quality of the cannabis that you're receiving because it's under regulation. And two, you can tax
Yeah.
it, right? You can make all this money off of it and it's largely harmless, right? I'm surprised that Minnesota overlooked that ability to fund schools, I guess.
Well, watch what happens though in fall of 22 when they come back. I'm sure. Well, I don't think this will be repealed. Just looking at the politics in the state, but I'm sure that they will change some of these regulations, including the taxation and probably also the availability.
Interestingly enough, without getting too political, I actually appreciate consumption taxes. A lot of people think of them as like sin taxes, but I don't actually agree with that because, if you don't want to pay the tax, don't buy the product, right? Whereas with say an income tax, they're taking money from you no matter what. So I think it would benefit Minnesota, especially like you said, when you come back in the fall. I mean, think about it because it's one, get it out of 7-Elevens and stuff. It's too easy to accidentally sell to a minor, things like that. But if you regulate it properly, like liquor, there's a lot of money to be had for doing good without actually adversely affecting the people who are consuming the product, I guess.
Yeah, I think bottom line, what it's going to do is hasten the adoption of a recreational system here, something that looked like it was pretty far off politically, but suddenly just to get things adjusted correctly, it wouldn't surprise me if in the next few years it'll happen.
Yeah, and really, what's the end result, right, is going to be for every, and I think it's like 27 states or something right now. The end result is that the federal government's just going to throw up their hands,
Right.
and then we're going to
Yes.
start seeing a lot of progress. We're going to start seeing, the higher concentrated medicinal benefits through science, and we're going to start seeing all kinds of things that you can do with it. But let's get a little bit back here on we're already moving pretty far along here, and I want to make sure that we educate our people, our listeners, because a lot of people really don't understand the difference, right? Hemp is weed, weed is hemp. Wait, can I get high from hemp? That type of stuff, which we just discussed. Yes, you actually can, but that's um what is industrial hemp or ditchweed or naturalized hemp? What are these things that we have here that we hear about?
Sure. So we industrial hemp has a legal definition, and I think, although I haven't looked at them all, it's the same in every state, and it's the same federally, and that is 0.3%. The material that you're growing needs to be 0.3% THC or lower, and there's a testing system, there's a licensing system for growing it, and there is a testing requirement for the material so that the material you're growing as industrial hemp can actually be certified so that you have a document that says, yes, Tom, what you grew in your field is in fact, according to the state of Minnesota, industrial hemp. And that's required for selling it. So it is a regulated system, and the testing is super important to the point of them saying, and here is how you test. Here's how you walk through the field and you're testing. Here's the part of the plant you take, how you, and so on. So it's all it's more tightly regulated than the other crops I've been working with, that's for sure. So that is the industrial hemp side of things. Uh, you mentioned ditchweed, and maybe we'll talk more about that later. That's the starting material that I work with in my own breeding program by choice, for reasons we can talk about later. But ditchweed, in fact, is industrial hemp from another era, if you will, because with in the history of hemp, hemp has been grown since settlement, right on through in Minnesota to the 1940s, maybe, probably the end of the 1940s, and the last big crop was for the World War II effort when fiber was grown. And many people know that the hemp for victory sort of idea was a big deal in the Midwest. But the thing about hemp is that if you grow it in a place, the seeds will shatter, and that means they jump off they fall off the plant, and are either eaten by birds or are spread by just the crop moving around, and it very easily what's called naturalizes or grows by itself in areas so long as you leave it alone. If there's kind of a disturbed area, something's maybe plowed up and then people walk away from it for a little while, it's not unusual for hemp to grow. And so this crop that ended in 1945, its descendants continue to grow to this day in rural Minnesota and not so rural Minnesota as well. And that's the ditchweed, but it traces back to those old hemp crops that have been grown around areas forever.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the fiber portion of this in the 40s. For those that, in fact, I'm wearing a hemp shirt right now. Um, but it was more for cordage, right? For ropes and things like that, or were they using it for other things?
Yeah, really, the certainly the military interest was for coarser fiber, as you say, for rope, also for things as esoteric as sewing soles on military soles on military boots, for instance, because it made a very tough thread. And that was the nature of the fiber that came off those plants. Just like other fibers, there are types of hemp that result in really fine fiber for textiles, like perhaps what you're wearing, and then there are other fiber types that are a little bit more coarse, and and the material that is the naturalized stuff or the feral stuff or the ditchweed. Those are all synonyms. Would be the coarser stuff, I believe.
Okay, so ditchweed and naturalized hemp are the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah, and a lot of people call it, you might hear me calling it feral hemp just because that's the word we use around our program. But some people don't like that word because it sounds more like cats than, than a plant. But
Well, I mean, wild, right? We're talking about wild hemp.
yes, that's
We're
right.
talking about we go out on a hike and there's hemp. That's
Yeah, it
wild hemp.
is.
Okay, fair enough. Now you're working on modifying, or maybe not modifying is the wrong word because when you start talking about genetic modification, people get really twitchy. You're working on optimizing the genes for hemp to be able to produce something. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I'm really focused on the grain side of things because of my belief that it can make a difference, in the agriculture and food system here in the Midwest. So what am I focusing on? I'm focusing on things like dense inflorescences. That doesn't sound unlike a drug type crop either, does it? But
No.
dense inflorescences for a different reason, so that we get a lot of seeds, so we get a really high seed yield. I'm also interested in things that have lots of branches, so that we can maximize the number of flowers on a plant and a certain height. So I have this is called an idiotype in breeding. Well, anyway, I won't spell it on the fly, but idiotype. So I have an idea of what an ideal plant would look like, and that is, as I've mentioned, branchy, lots of dense inflorescences, a certain height, something around maybe 6 to 8 feet tall, something that's manageable in a field by existing equipment that farmers probably have for growing corn, for instance, or even soybeans. And something else that I'm really interested in working on is what's in those seeds. So, without belaboring this piece, when maybe we talk about it later, there are three components to seeds that are really important. Like using hemp grain for hemp hearts or something like that is only going to have so much of a market, and so that's not going to reshape Minnesota agriculture. But if we start looking at what is in that seed in the same way we might look at what's in the corn seed or what's in the soybean seed and how can we use that, if we do that with hemp, we find that there's a really high quality cooking oil in hemp. There is a really high quality protein in the hemp that can be isolated, has a really nice color, has really good functionality, and there are additional fiber materials that are also involved. And so these three things, the carbs, the protein, and the oil that can be extracted from the seed, that I think if we can create a demand for that in our food system, in food formulations, that's the sort of thing that can explode the demand for the crop and result. If there's that demand there, we've talked about economic sustainability for farmers. It's that demand that's going to drive price and make it a crop that farmers are going to want to grow.
So that's interesting. So I want to explore this a little bit more, but I want to touch on this just because some of our listeners are going to be like, well, what about, and what about textiles? I mean, I get that your primary goal, we understand that you're trying to help the farmers in Minnesota, and that makes sense. And I'm not arguing that. But why not textiles? Because there's certainly a demand for nice clothing, for durable clothing, for whatever you want to call it. Insulation is a good example. Organic wool has become a big thing for insulation lately. So why not that?
Oh, absolutely. Really good question. And I'll tell you why. And again, this is Tom talking, and there are going to be absolutely advocates for fiber. And frankly, I'm an advocate for fiber too. But if I look at this pragmatically about what is likely to drive demand initially, then fiber's a tough sell because it requires infrastructure that we don't have, like or that is not common. Let me say it that way. Not that it doesn't exist. It's just that it doesn't exist at the level that we need it to really get into the fiber side of things. So,
When you
for
say
what
we, who's we?
I guess I'm taking a look at the agricultural system writ large. So
In the
everything
United
from yeah,
States?
yes, let me say in the United States, and I'll maybe even say in the upper Midwest, but I think this actually applies pretty broadly. So for instance, it starts with the farmer. How does a farmer harvest that fiber crop? It's a tough, it's an unusual thing to harvest. Now you can take a sickle mower and drop it down, but then there's this stage called retting, which essentially is rotting, where you let the cut down hemp rot for a little while so the fiber is easier to extract. And then how do you actually pull the fibers, this part that's called, well, it depends whether you call it breaking or scutching. It's taking the fibers off of the central part of the stem, the cortex, because the fiber is wrapped around this solid core of practically cellulose. So you pull that fiber off, you need to do that step, and then you need to refine it. There are a lot of steps that are involved in getting that from the coarse fiber to being a fiber you can actually use. And that infrastructure has been lost in the US. It was here, but now it's lost. And I also should mention that a lot of fiber back in the day in the U.S. was only economically possible because of slave labor. There's a part of the process called breaking where you're extracting the fiber from the stem that you've cut down, and it's literally back-breaking work, and that was done by people. And it was often done in areas that had slave labor. That's actually who did it. So now, if you fast forward, of course, it needs to be done mechanically, but we don't have that mechanical prowess in enough quantity to say tomorrow we're going to start growing fiber hemp and we're going to grow a lot of it. It's something that needs to evolve. It will because of the sort of interest that you've expressed in these products, but it's not there yet.
So when we think about this, what we're really talking about are countries like China, where textiles are part of their economic
Yeah.
infrastructure now. Whereas with us, our economic infrastructure has moved in a different direction over time.
Also in Europe,
It
Italy and France have grown fiber for a long time. Italy makes particularly good fine fiber, but you also see some work in the Netherlands. And when I take a look at agricultural implements, machinery that's being developed to do this fiber sort of stuff, uh, you can kind of hunt around in some of the European websites and you see some really cool things being developed. So it's not like it won't happen. It's
right.
just that it's not out in the barn yet. You know, people can't use it here.
Well, I think it's interesting, and the reason I brought up China specifically was because they have access to a lot of something that, for this process, uh, I could argue is better than hemp, and that's bamboo.
Ah,
Because bamboo is it doesn't it just keeps growing, right? You chop it off, 90 days later you can chop it again, 90 days later you can chop it again. It's and you can use it as depending on what you're doing with it. Not only can you use it for textiles, but you can use it for construction materials and things like that. So I found that kind of interesting as we talk about the sustainability of hemp versus specifically for China versus something they already have that's there, right? That being said, so you are optimizing these seeds for agriculture, which I think is great. In fact, uh, you had sent an email to Lindsay with some in-depth information. Lindsay's our producer, um, and I read that email. And in honor of this episode, I actually went and immediately bought 3 pounds of hemp flour. And I did that for a reason. I've had hemp hearts in the fridge and stuff in the past, but I did it for a reason because what popped in my head is we're talking about corn and we're talking about soy, and we want to get a crop rotation. But then if we're talking about flour, you're talking about wheat, and it was curious to me what kind of properties would be required to modify, because obviously, I mean, wheat is the flour of choice for 98% whatever you do. But obviously, hemp is going to be gluten free. And I wonder if there is what the protein properties and things like that, like what kind of bread would you get out of hemp flour? Do you think that there's or an opportunity there for, say, wheat farmers to be able to recycle, or not recycle, or rejuvenate their soil as well by introducing something like a hemp for flour and grain?
you know, I did you try using the hemp flour
Not
for?
not yet. I ordered it like half an hour ago. I'm going to try it this week when I get
Yeah.
it.
So, well, you hit on the the part that has my head spinning, and that is the gluten. So, of course, when you bake bread, you need something that's trapping the CO2 that's evolving from the yeast, and it's the elastic gluten type proteins that capture that in wheat, and we
Right.
don't have that. And so in hemp, it's just not part of it, and it's not something that I would select for because there are some things that you select for that you can change that make sense to me, and others that you don't. Like if you have a crop like wheat that's great as far as gluten, then use wheat. I say the same thing when it comes to trying to improve the amino acid balance of corn or soybeans so they're more complete proteins. It's just like just eat them together and you're okay. So I like working with maybe it's the easy way out, but I wouldn't try to adjust hemp to become a bread making flour, but you could obviously use it as an additional component if it brought something interesting, if it brought a flavor to a bread product or it gave it a property like in I'm thinking of a pastry or a donut. Maybe it has a property there that would give it a really cool texture or something, and then I would do that. But more of what I'm thinking of for use of grain is if you take a look at a label and it says in there that there is uh, high uh, soybean protein concentrate or soybean protein isolate is in there to improve. So like, I don't know, I should probably pull a energy bar out of my briefcase here, and I bet it says something like that. Or it might say whey protein as an isolate. And if instead we could show that hemp protein isolate has the same or better functionality, and by functionality, I mean, what else does it do in the product besides just having protein? What does it do in terms of texture? How does it combine with other materials? Is it soluble in water? Is it soluble in alcohol, high pH, low pH? All those things are things food scientists think about very deeply. And so we have these folks testing our hemp and telling us, in these sort of products, it could really work. It could work in these sort of sport drinks or not in others. And suddenly, this door has opened to an immediately large demand. So, if I were to say we could substitute soybean protein isolate with hemp protein isolate, and it would have the same function and qualities in a product, think of the demand. That's hyperbole. I think it would result in a great deal of demand for the product, and that's more where I'm going as far as what you do with the grain.
No, I would agree, and you're right. So one of the things that a lot of food advocates talk about is diversification, right? Because the more you consume of a particular product, I mean, a lot of people just don't really understand that. You know, chances are, if you bought it out the store and it's not produce, you're going to get corn or soy in it, right?
Right,
That's
that's right.
that's the deal, right?
It
Your
is.
protein bar is a perfect example, but it's not just protein bars, even your meat, right? Because mass production cow is going to have soy and corn in it.
They are corn and soybean carrier. They're
Exactly.
built from corn and
No,
soybean.
that is exactly right. And you'll get an organic farmer some more. Well, they also use leftover candy. I was like, what do you think candy's made out of? Corn and soy, right? So from that
So a
perspective,
shout out to the grass-fed beef growers.
that's exactly
Right?
right. A shout out to the
Shout out to them.
grass-fed beef growers. In fact, I mean, our family is privileged enough to be able to. We don't buy meat from the store. We buy whole pigs. We buy whole cows from local homesteaders, and the quality and the flavor. I mean, everything about it is just better. That being said, um, going back to the diversification, so this diversification will cause two things. One, it's better health. So if we're looking at it from a perspective, not getting on a soapbox, but just saying this is going to produce healthier families. That's very important. But let's also be honest. Our society, as I'm talking about the mob, the entire society, I'm not talking about you personally or myself personally or whatever. Our society cares more about the economic capabilities of X than the health of X. So what in X being hemp. So if you're successful, what you've done is not only you have vastly improved the quality of soil, but you've also vastly improved economic outlook based on these crops. And the side effect of these two things is you vastly improved food and thus nutrient diversification for our people. Is that accurate?
It sounds like a win-win to me, doesn't it? It
It
just
does. It absolutely does. Which, of course, this is why you're working on it, right? So
that's yeah, I'm sticking by that. That is kind of how I'm thinking about it. It just seems like it could really fit together, but we do need to be able to find that demand. What's going to drive the demand? Because as you said, right, so much revolves around the economics of this thing.
that's right. And we have other challenges, though. So because of prohibition and narcotics regulations, and frankly, without getting conspiratorial, I kind of believe the government has an economic interest in keeping hemp and cannabis under tight control. But beyond that, because of those regulations, uh, we have a problem with the diversification of the seeds, right? Or having a way. So, well, for example, a USDA, say, seed bank or something like that.
We have a problem, especially if we're thinking about breeding and improving crops. We have a problem in accessing materials that we can breed with. And if you haven't been involved in breeding, it's a piece of the puzzle that you just may not have thought about. But you need diversity in order to breed something better. And the classic way of doing breeding is you take something that's pretty good, a variety that's pretty good. It doesn't matter what the crop is, and there's a flaw in it. It might have some sort of a disease susceptibility, and you find another version of that same species so that it can intercross that has the resistance, but maybe it doesn't have good commercial quality. Maybe it tastes terrible or whatever, but it has the resistance. Now you've got the diversity you need to do the cross between them and select for the best of both, which is all of that great quality the original variety has, but now it also has the resistance. So you need that sort of diversity. Well, we're missing the diversity side of this because of the prohibition that you mentioned. The seed banks that we have for all the other crops, whether it's USDA seed banks or whether it's university breeders like me who keep small seed banks that we work with, or whether it's private individuals, have this sort of diversity around that they can use to make the crosses. Well, that's just not available in cannabis. Uh,
So,
Go ahead.
well, and now that's interesting to me. You said in cannabis. So switching back to, well, I understand that for you, hemp is really fun. But for people that understand cannabis as a general rule, there's a different kind of fun. Um,
Okay.
and you said there's not enough diversification. Well, if you walk into a cannabis store in Washington, there is literally hundreds of different strains, and they all vary between sativa and indica, and they all have different properties among them that will cause different types of things to happen. A good example is, your low THC, high CBD strains that people use for inflammation, or they use them to make tinctures, because to get the concentration high enough to help manage their pain or their epilepsy or whatever. Isn't that kind of, I mean, from a hemp perspective, but isn't that what we're kind of talking about? Those different strains that have been
Yeah.
cultivated to produce X?
Right. Yes. And when I said cannabis earlier, I immediately thought, yeah, but the high THC situation that's a different kettle of fish. That has been, and And even though that was being done clandestinely for an awful long period of time, there was an effort to bring in diversity. And there was a lot of effort in trying to put together interesting combinations and kind of see what happened and try to figure out some general rules about what goes with what. And as a result, we get what you see in a dispensary. We have over here your sativas, we have over here your indicas, and here we have your hybrids. And those are not so much botanical taxonomic categories, although some would say leaf sizes or whatever. But it's really about the effect of the plant, as far as I can tell, pharmacopsychologically on what sort of an effect you want. So yeah, that sort of diversity. But when it comes down to if we're trying to improve industrial hemp, uh, that's only in its infancy in trying to put together that sort of diversity and those sort of resources.
So, and I want to go down this path a little bit, but just for our listeners who don't know, it boils down to this: sativa makes you think, indica makes you eat. Okay, that's what it boils down to. It, it's absolutely true. Sativa makes you think, indica makes you eat. Okay, so but beyond that, so let's say the government actually does something good for once and says, you know what, this is ridiculous. We're fighting a losing battle. We finally realize we're fighting a losing battle. So instead of continuing to fight a losing battle, we're going to pull out and set these regulations and have go forth and be a happy population. And high THC cannabis is now legal based on certain specifics, and researchers have full access to it. And industrialized hemp is, it's got its same classification. at that point, would that actually benefit your research? Would you be able to say, okay, I realize that if I consume this as it sits now, I'm going to eat that entire chocolate cake. But there is a property within this particular strain of this high THC strain that allows me to have a longer growing season. Maybe it's more uh, cold tolerant or something. Is that something that would benefit you and your research?
It might, but there might be an easier way to do some of those things. And the reason that I pause, it isn't the diversity. Heavens, there's a lot of diversity, a lot of difference between the high THC materials and the industrial hemp materials by and large. And part of that is from where it came from, for instance. So a lot of the industrial hemp stuff, like, it all kind of originated in Asia, and some say maybe more northern China, some say more Central Asia, but that's kind of where things started. But if you take a look at the history of how it spread and the different uses, the the spread of cannabis kind of to the north and westerly into Europe, that was the material that was focused more on domestication for use in fiber. And the stuff that moved more south, especially getting down toward the Indian subcontinent, that domestication was more for medicinal and drug use. So we get these two big differences that go way back in history in terms of their use, and that drives the nature, sort of the genetics of the plant. So if we take a look at industrial hemp now and compare that to what's going on with the high cannabinoid THC sort of stuff. Wow, they're really different. They're very diverse, and that goes way back to their origins. The problem for me in using that, let's say it becomes suddenly legal, would I want to actually make crosses with it to increase the diversity? It might be a problem for me because I'd be introducing some growth characteristics that I really probably don't want in an industrial hemp situation. When you think of industrial hemp being grown, for instance, out in the field, it's grown at very high populations. It's not grown on 4x4 centers the way CBD or THC hemp might be grown in the field. It's grown like corn. At very higher populations, in fact, very high populations. And that takes a different sort of plant architecturally. And so, I might, because of the reason that you said, want to try to pick off some particular characteristics of the seeds. But that might be more diversity than I would care to chew on, to tell you the truth.
Okay, that's fair. So let's talk about um, so not to state the obvious, but one of the problems that we're trying to solve with industrialized hemp for food is that when you grow a single crop or you don't or only two crops, it adversely and you do this every year, it can adversely affect the quality of the soil. Now, this is when we add a third crop, for example, industrialized hemp, we are further diversifying the nutrients that the soil requires and how it can produce a better product overall. But you mentioned something about hemp that is, I'm curious how this would be handled. So I have, let's say, 1,000 acres, just as an example, and I grow corn and I grow in one season, then I grow soy in one season, and now I'm growing hemp in one season. And we have figured out some of the problems. There's now an economic demand. It no longer has to be a boutique farm. The nutrition profile is great. It's good for, say, pasta, but not bread. Okay, just as an example. Um, you mentioned that one of the things that happens with hemp is that although it is not a perennial, meaning it will not come back every year, the same plant won't come back every year. When it matures and when it goes to reproduction, the seeds will burst. They will jump from the plant, land in the dirt, and if they're left alone, they will grow. One of the interesting things about wheat is, as I understand it, there is a similar problem, but if you let it get too far. But what a lot of people, there's a group of scientists now that are suspecting that the increase of celiac disease and gluten intolerance is due to the fact that many farmers will pre-kill their crop with Roundup in an effort to make the drying process more efficient to get it to market. So there's a there. It's not. I'm not disparaging any product. I'm just saying that there is a suspicion there from a group of scientists that suggests that this is a problem we're causing through chemicals. How does the diversification, adding hemp to the corn and soy, how do we deal with that problem? Because I assume that there's a similar problem with these other products, right?
Yeah, so the purpose of using Roundup or some other chemical to burn down that crop at the end of the season is try to get uniform maturity so that you can harvest. Otherwise, you might have some plants that are still too high moisture, too green, the seed's not mature, or other stuff that's ready to mature and it's going to shatter. So get everything's evened out so that it becomes a much more efficient harvest. But as you said, you're using chemistry on these crops. This is a pretty common thing to do in crops. You don't do it in corn, really. I've never heard of instances, maybe some people do it, but it's not a common practice. But it would be a practice that might be used in other crops to try to even things up. And that often happens when you have a crop that flowers over a long period of time, because you can imagine if the grain that's produced from the first flowers is going to mature the first, and grain from the last flowers is going to mature last. And if that last flower came a month later, you're twiddling your thumbs waiting for that stuff to get mature, and so you might use some sort of chemistry in order to burn it down. Now, the reason I bring all that up is uh, hemp is the poster child for long flowering period. So it, hemp females are starting to flower roughly now in Minnesota in my fields, and those things are going to keep flowering right into late August. That's 6 weeks of flowering. So that means you have many different maturities on that plant, and you are waiting for things to get mature. And as a result, the seeds, it's usually you get the earliest stuff toward the bottom. Those seeds are shattering and are lying on the ground and are lost to me as I'm waiting for the other seed to come. So it is possible that one might in future years have agronomists saying, well, should we use something to hasten maturity in that way? But it's not something that would happen now. And that's because of a regulatory situation where you really can only use chemistry, you're only supposed to use chemistry that has been tested and is approved and on the label of that product for particular crops. So it would have to say, here's how you use it on hemp, right on the you mentioned Roundup, on the Roundup label. Well, there are no chemistries that I know of that are on the that where hemp is on the label. So right now you can't use anything, and that means that supposedly there's no chemicals that are used in hemp production. Uh, in many, a lot of times you use this chemistry, like you mentioned Roundup, and so there's Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready soybeans. It's used to control weeds. But one of the really cool things about hemp that advocates have long said you don't need to use any herbicides in hemp. It's kind of true because if you grow it at a tight spacing, it grows so darn fast this time of year uh, that it smothers out weeds really well.
It
So
becomes its own cover crop.
it is amazing that way. I just can't tell you how, even after several years of growing this crop, this time of years, I'm just amazed at how fast it grows from being 1 foot tall to being over my head. It's just literally a couple of weeks.
So, okay, this is going to be a bad pun dad joke kind of situation, but you could actually say it grows like a weed.
Oh, God, does it ever? Yes.
All right. So, what is what's the base? What kind of infrastructure do we not have? I mean, that we need in order to make industrialized hemp and let's forget textiles. Let's talk about for solving your problem.
Yeah.
How how do we? What is the farmers need? You mentioned that you're one of the things that you're trying to do is cultivate a strain that allows it to grow in a way where we could either a reuse existing infrastructure or b with as little modification as possible. What are we talking about there? Are we talking like hay balers or what?
Well, when it comes to grain production, I'll start with that, and I will mention fiber a bit, but um, when it comes to grain production, the beauty of grain production from hemp is that that infrastructure is pretty well in place now, at both at the farm level and also at the receiving at the grain elevator level, because it's just a grain, and so you can deal with it like other grains. So looking at farmers around the Midwest anyway, unless they're doing specialty crops or hort stuff or something like that, if they're corn soybean growers, they have a combine, and they have a soybean header and they have a corn header. So the header is the part on the front that gathers up the crop correctly and feeds it into the combine. The combine is where the seed is threshed free of the rest of the residue. So you have to have a different header for different crops. Well, you could use, and it is being done, where a grain header, like something you'd use for wheat. Oh, that's the classic thing that your listeners, when they think of that sort of rotating, it's called a reel, the rotating part in front that's feeding the grain, the amber waves of grain, and you could use one of those. You just pick it up. These are all on hydraulic lifters, and you could lift up that head so it's running maybe 3, 4 feet off the ground where the seeds are in hemp, and take it through the field and cut that right off, and feed it into the combine. And there you go. Without even really buying any new equipment, you can harvest this crop. So my contention is much of the infrastructure that is currently on farm can be used for the grain crop. There's something you have to beef it up. It's a tough crop, right? We already mentioned that it has tough fibers in it, and so literally you have to make sure you have a good fire extinguisher on your combine, because that cordage can wrap around things that move, and that will create heat, and it can create fires if you're not careful. I mean, I don't want to scare people, but yeah, isn't that something else? So your combine can catch on fire, not a good thing for $1 million piece of equipment. So one of the things you have to have is a good fire extinguisher. The other thing, though, you have to kind of beef up some of the systems, because it's not wheat that you're cutting, it's hemp, which is pretty tough. So, uh, but in terms of handling the grain, now you take that grain and you need to make sure that it's at the right moisture level. Well, farmers have grain dryers, so you can use the same sort of grain dryer. You can use the same belts for conveyance. So the stuff that's on the farm is can be used for this crop. Now you could take it to the grain elevator and assume that they receive that crop, the grain crop. Same thing for them. They can store it the same way, they can move it the same way, and it just becomes one more specialty grain, which is kind of cool. So the infrastructure, I would contend, is if not completely in place, that it's pretty darn close. And that's really important for whether you can grow a new crop in an area. Like if we were to say Minnesota can grow peanuts, so let's grow peanuts. Well, the infrastructure is not here for harvesting peanuts from under the ground, or for drying them correctly, or let alone doing the fancier roasting or whatever. So you need to have a crop that fits the infrastructure, and on the grain side, I would contend that it does pretty well. It takes some expertise. I'm not minimizing the fact that a grower needs to learn some new tricks, but it's within the realm of reason, I would believe. With fiber, we touched on this before. We don't grow much fiber. Some people grow flax for fiber, and that would maybe be the closest thing in the upper Midwest to what hemp would be like. But that's a real specialty thing, and the infrastructure. I mean, you'd be a maverick working with hemp for fiber right now. I'm not saying you're completely on your own, because there are other people who are interested in doing it, but it would be kind of an individual effort.
Okay, so we'll start wrapping this up here, but for our listeners who are not agriculturally inclined, can you take a moment and explain why this is going to help the soil? What is the problem that's being solved beyond, we've talked about the diversification of nutrition and things like that, but from an actual growing perspective, can you help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll give you three things. Uh, One is that each type of crop has a different type of nutrient demand. So if you continue to grow the same crop, then you're continuing to mine the same nutrients at the same quantity from the soil, and over time it's going to be depleted unless you end up replacing it with, for instance, synthetic fertilizers. And so you uh, so there's a continuous demand for the same thing from the soil if you don't change your crop. If you change your crop, now you have diversified what those demands are. All the crops are going to, it's not hugely different, but it can be different enough that diversification alone can be a benefit in terms of the nutrient demands on the soil. The second thing is we're learning more and more about the biology of the soil and what's going on there. And different crops support different microbiomes in the soil. And so if you can diversify the crop you're growing, you're going to diversify the microbiome. And that helps. The more diversity you have in the soil, the greater the sustainability of that soil as well. So we've got the nutrient demand, we've got the microbiology. I'll throw in another one in that when we're taking a look at building soil health, we're also looking at what the residues are for the crop. What we're taking the grain away from the field, but we're leaving a lot of stuff in the field that gets plowed back in as organic matter. That breaks down and helps provide nutrition for subsequent crops. If we're always growing the same crop, then we're putting the same organic matter back in, and it's not kind of a diverse organic matter. Like if it's corn, for instance, if we're growing soy, we're putting back organic matter that probably has a higher nitrogen content, for instance, than the corn stover that's being plowed back in. The same sort of thing could happen with hemp. I'm not familiar enough with the differences in corn, soy, and hemp to be able to tell you exactly what the differences are in what's being returned to the soil, but I'm confident enough to say they are going to be different and that diversity can help. And I will give you a bonus fourth one, which is something we're working on, and that is the root systems of these crops differ quite a bit. How deep they go, for instance, how fibrous they are, can really make a difference. And if you think three-dimensionally in the soil, where those roots are placed and what they do is going to differ by crop. And what has been reported about hemp is it has a very deep and extensive root system. And one of the things that we are starting to evaluate is the ability of hemp, compared to corn, for instance, to suck up some of the nutrients that are problems in our groundwater, in particular nitrate. So nitrate moving into groundwater is a big problem. It's a problem for drinking water. It's also a problem in getting into our water systems going down the Mississippi River and polluting the Gulf of Mexico. So we're interested in whether hemp might remediate some of the nitrate that's leaching through the soil profile. So that's another benefit of having some diversity of agriculture.
Okay, so now that we have our next 7 episodes,
Yeah, did you
um,
did I just sound like I was giving a lecture there? I'm
no,
sorry.
no, not at
I
all.
flipped into professor mode.
um, no, actually, this is fascinating to me because I'm going to state something here that seems obvious, but it's not. So you said we're just now learning about like microbes and stuff in soil and so on and so forth. Now, I agree with you. I think that our science and our place in humanity at this point, we are just now, let's say, identifying the various things that need to happen to truly have, say, healthy soil, for example. Um, but couldn't we also be kind of honest and say, sure, 500 years ago, we didn't know the name of it, but it was pretty obvious that we had to do this crop rotation and things
Yeah,
like that. Isn't that
right.
isn't that true?
Well, you know what? I immediately started thinking about prairie soils because of where I am, right? So tall grass prairies around
Right.
this part of Minnesota, and those are not monocultures, and they're tremendously diverse, and they resulted in these fabulous soils that we're still mining, unfortunately, today. But yeah, you can right.
So
It's
basically,
obvious.
what we're doing now, what you and I are talking about right now, is trying to fix a problem that we, as industrialized society, created that was solved pre-industrialized
Yeah,
society.
yeah, that's true. You know, JD, it's this tension we have. We want to grow food or other materials, but let's say food because you and I both appreciate that. We're trying to grow food from this field. So how do we do that? How do we meet this need of the population, but try to do it in a way that mimics as best we can some of those principles that you were just talking about that we learned, for instance, from prairie soil. So it's tough, right? It's just what we're trying to do is try to find that correct balance, and that balance moves. But the more we know, I think the smarter we can do it.
Well, and that's the end game, right? Is that we are trying to create the highest efficiency. And when we say efficiency, we're talking about nutrient density, we're also talking about yield, and we're talking about economic viability. Um, for things that, 500 years ago, we didn't have 8 billion people on the planet, right? So you were able to provide for those things at a much smaller scale. It's always easier to do at a smaller scale. Would you agree with that?
It is easier to do at a smaller scale. Yeah, yeah. And it's easier to do when you have, I don't know quite how to say this, more more people touching the land in a way, more density of uh, intensity of agriculture in the sense of humans being involved. And we're really going the other way now, so that especially with more mechanized agriculture, it's fewer touches on the ground. People watching, more or less eyes on the land, and somehow I think that has an impact too.
I think you're right. And I'm going to close with this. Um, what you just said, the people, less people touching the ground. There has been studies that have shown, for example, for all the benefits of high density housing that or there are benefits to high density housing. The more you live in high density housing, as well as the closer you live to freeways, the higher chances you have of getting cancer. Um, my mother, who I love and adore and respect deeply, does not understand, does for whatever reason, she doesn't understand the idea of going to a farm and purchasing my cow or purchasing my pig. Meat comes from the store for her. And why I bring that up is that as humans, as a species, we're actually not designed for that, right? Genetically speaking, I mean, they've shown time and time again that one of the best warriors for depression is the outdoors, because you're touching the land and the fresh air, and you're getting out of the stressors that can um, cause depression, or cause the items that can cause depression for those who are chronically depressed to flare, right? The chemical imbalances and things like that. So for my listeners, and Tom, I think you would agree, uh, I would encourage you to go touch the ground, put your hand in the soil, and if you should feel good. Soil is not dirt. Soil is what brings life. It brings life for everything that we do. It all starts right there from your, whether it be your food or your clothing, it all starts with the how healthy your soil is, because it's what brings forth everything. And with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. And our guest today was Tom Michaels, professor of horticulture at the University of Minnesota and founder of the Open Source Seed Initiative.